Welcome back. This is week 10, lecture 2. World War II or simply continuation? Now, the title is basically asking a moot question because what it's asking is what was the relationship between the Great War and then the next war that broke out on a world scale. The terms World War I and World War II are so completely entrenched in our consciousness and our minds and our understandings of the historiography that there is no real sense in questioning that terminology. Now, I've said before, I think, that so often the terms we use, the adjectives we use to describe historical events affect and shape our understanding of those events. And so that's what this is really getting at. It's not so much to argue that, we should just call it, the Great War from 1914 to 1945 with the truce period of 20 years or less than, but that it's to see how these two conflicts develop and what was the relationship between them. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't use the terms World War I and World War II, but it's really to see the relationship, to see this period as a continuing process, an issue, as it was at the time. I think I mentioned that the question was at the Treaty of Versailles, was this really a peace or was it simply a truce until conflict would break out again? So that's what this is really getting at, to understand this momentous event. So often, World War II has played itself on our consciousness to a far greater extent, so many ways than World War I, that we look back on World War I, and we don't see it for the shock that it was. And we can talk about this almost 50-year period, 1914, 1945, so 40-year period, as being a really transformative period. War changed. Our understanding of humanity changed. Our understanding, our identity changed. I talked about some of that in the last lecture. This then just follows on with the continuation of the process as it was unfolding. To do that, we go back to Hitler. And we have up here Hitler on the offensive. Because as I discussed last lecture, Germany was humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. And it began to be a problem, especially with the hyperinflation that came up in the 20s. I talked about last lecture, and then the onset of the Great Depression and the unemployment that the world was suffering, but Germany was really suffering, and they had all these reparations to pay. That's where we get the agreements at Locarno. And the Western powers, Britain, France, and the United States, began to realize, there are some issues here. What do we do with Germany? What do we allow and what do we not? Especially as Hitler was portraying himself as the guardian against communism, which was seen by the West, i.e., Britain, France, and the United States, basically, as an increasing threat. So what do we do? What do we do? How do we deal with this figure who's rising to power and comes into power in 1933? How do we handle him? What do we allow? And he starts complaining about not only the treaty itself, but the unfairness of it. And his whole point was to restore German pride and dignity as he was building, at first, not implicitly and then explicitly, a new German empire, or the Third Reich. Again, we have the First German Empire, which is the Empire of Frederick Barbarossa in the 12th century, which was kind of synonymous at the time with the Holy Roman Empire. So the Erste Deutsche Reich was seen as that Holy Roman Empire. Okay. Then we have the Second German Reich, the unification of Germany under Bismarck and the Kaiser, which is just a German term of Caesar. And then with Hitler, we begin talking about the Third German Reich, the reestablishment of German dignity and pride. That was what was going on. And he also added an additional ingredient to this, so to speak, that the German Reich, the German people, the German folk which is a German term, V-O-L-K, not F-O-L-K, or folk. Our folk, the German folk, has these connotations of an ethnic identity and unity. That brings us to the term Aryanism and the purity of the blood. Now, Aryanism has been a debunked racial theory, but that's what it was, a racial theory, that the Aryan race was a superior race. The Aryan race was based on the Indo-European linguistic group, family. It also was called Aryan, from the Indo-European, from India, basically. The historical linguists were developing in the 19th century on into the 20th century and finding the roots of the European languages and seeing the roots of language with ethnic identities. And I'm not a linguist. I think it's fascinating. I really do. But and it gets at something. But the problem is when you start adding ideological understandings and beliefs to that, it can get really messed up. But we still have this sense of Sanskrit being the origins of Indo-European. And then we have the Semitic languages and the non-Semitic languages, and it gets very kind of complex. But in Europe today, most of Europe, the coming from Greek and Latin, the development, or Germanic, which is a distinct linguistic group from the Romance languages, as they're called, coming from Greek and Latin. They're all Indo-European, but there are some languages spoken and used in Europe that are not Indo-European. Hungarian, Finnish, some of the Basque in Spain, the Basque language. There's a few others. Estonian, I think, is non-Indo-European, whereas Russian is a Slavic language. So it's like, okay, how do we deal with all of this? And the Aryan position was that there is a distinct linguistic ethnic identity of Aryan, and they didn't really make the connection of like that having started in India and or the Middle East, Iran, India, but that became the master race. And it was associated with Northern Europeans primarily. Now that then played into the whole eugenics aspect that I talked about last time. It was part of the same kind of overall scientific program endeavor, and Hitler seized on that and started talking about the purity of the blood, the purity of the ethnic identity and the Aryan identity, which was not just Germans, but Germans were seen as like the epitome of the Aryan race, and the other races were inferior, and Jews were not Aryan. We'll get to that as we get there. So this concept of German pride as the superior race by nature, by creation, was part of the rebuilding of German pride and dignity in wake of the humiliation that was coming from the Treaty of Versailles. And Hitler starts to try to rebuild this. And actually, he was rather successful in getting Germany economically back on track, just as Mussolini was in Italy with fascism. Let's kind of help out and get things going and make things work again. And Mussolini did that, and Hitler was doing that. And he had a good deal of popular support. I talked about that popular nationalism, which then becomes fused with an ethnic identity. And that was what Hitler was all about. Story. And he starts chipping away at the reparations, at the guilt, everything else. And one of the things he started saying was that if Germany is a country of Germans, ethnic Germans, then there are Germans who are not living within Germany, or where they live should be part of Germany. And that brings us to Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland Germans in 1939, because Czechoslovakia was a country that was created after World War I, the breakup of World War I. And so it was like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Czechoslovakia was created there in the east. and there was a portion of Czechoslovakia where German speakers lived instead of speaking Czech. They spoke German. And that territory was called the Sudetenland, and it was predominantly inhabited by Germans. And Hitler's argument was that that should be part of Germany, based on linguistic origins, ethnic identity. That the Sudetenland should be part of Germany, and that's what he started arguing for. And he tried diplomatically to arrange that. It was agreed of this and this, that actually Czechoslovakia should return the Sudetenland to Germany. There were international agreements, but it wasn't really going forward. The president of Czechoslovakia at the time was a man named, last name was Beneš, B-E-N-E-S. I'm not sure what his first name was. He was resisting, because he's still, keep in mind, 1918, he's trying to carve out a Slavic state. It was only 20 years later, and Hitler's saying, no, you have to give up that territory. He's like, no, I'm not going to give up that territory. And the speech that Hitler gave to the Reichstag, to the world, basically, was that, right before he invaded, was that he had followed international law. He was doing everything that was supposed to be done, and there were agreements that had been made, and it was President Beneš who was not following them. It was President Beneš who was not adhering to the international agreements. And therefore, he basically says the ball is in your court, Mr. Beneš. Either follow the international agreements or war. And then Hitler invades Czechoslovakia to retake the Sudetenland. Here's a map of the area. You can see Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the orange kind of outlined border territory around the blue Czechoslovakia. That is the Sudetenland that Germany then occupies. Because that's another thing that Hitler did and was allowed to do, was to rearm Germany. So Germany had been demilitarized, but Hitler kept pushing at the need to rearm Germany for self-defensive purposes. That was the whole point. And the West said, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. We can understand that, especially in light of the threat of communism. If you look up there, we see Poland, and then the other side of Poland is Russia. So what if the Russians start to invade? We need to be able to defend ourselves. That was the rationale for the West, to keep appeasing Hitler. Okay, the Russians are a threat. Communism is a threat. Thank you, Adolf, for standing up. Yes, you may rearm for defensive strategies and purposes. Part of that then was to reclaim the Sudetenland. But Hitler's views and vision went far further. And he then invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, under the same pretexts, even though there weren't the international agreements, so to speak. His justification for doing so was the same thing, defensive strategy. We need, because Russia is right there, the communists are right there, we need to protect ourselves, we're going to invade Russia, or invade Poland. And from there, he began what was called the Blitzkrieg. Now, here's a map of the Blitzkrieg of 1940. April 9th, he goes into Norway and Denmark. April 10th, Belgium, and then the Netherlands, and then May 13th into France, and he was very successful occupying France. So France basically fell already in 1940 under German occupation. It was quite impressive what he had managed to achieve in a relatively short period of time. So he is feeling very good about things. And yet, when he invaded Poland, the Allies, namely Britain and France, with U.S. support, we'll get back to the U.S., said, wait a minute, he is going too far. He is, he's not just being defensive, he is being offensive. It's one thing to reappropriate or re-annex the Sudetenland, which he has a point there. He doesn't really have any point about Poland. And so, England and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939. And the Allies finally realized that this position of appeasement was not going to work. It wasn't working. Because what it did, it allowed Germany to remobilize, come to some position of strength, and to then start creating a third German empire, the Third Reich, under Nazi leadership, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by Hitler. This populist nationalism based on ethnic identity, purity of the blood of the superior race. That was what was going on, and it became horrific. I'm not going to go through all the steps of World War II. Read about those in the textbook a bit. You probably have had courses or covered World War II in parts of courses, whether it's U.S. courses from the U.S. perspective or world history courses or what have you in high school. So it's not unknown. I just want to point out some of the major developments and issues. And one was the bombing of London. Because already in November 1540, after Britain declares war on Germany, Germany's already occupying France right across the canal, the Channel, the English Channel. And they launch a massive bombing campaign of London. The thought was, if we were so successful with France, with the Netherlands, Belgium, because Belgium was just kind of Netherlands and Belgium was just going to use to go through to get into France. We were so successful. If we can just kind of wipe out England with one massive blow, maybe then we can check England off the list too, and we go from there. So there was this massive bombing campaign, which the British and the Londoners referred to as the Blitz. It was what almost brought England to its knees, and what allowed, let's say, England or a leader in England, namely Winston Churchill, to really come to the fore. He gives his famous speech about how we will fight on the seas, we'll fight on the shores, we'll fight in the air. And it was really this amazingly emotional speech. Say, we can withstand this blitz coming from the damn Germans who are bombing us. And this is it's a city. Were there military? Of course there were military targets, but it's a city. It's a capital city. So there's also this whole idea of total war, which we've seen kind of emerge in World War I with the civilian death toll. It's a war against countries and societies and peoples, not so much against armies as war usually had been in the name of the country. This was an attempt to shock and terrorize the British. And it came close to working, but it didn't. The British held firm under Churchill's leadership. They started bombing back. Berlin, more about that. Then Dresden, too. So there's this back and forth, and all kinds of destructions and horrors of the bombing lasted. The Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche in Berlin is still there. I visited it, did it in the early 1990s. It's just a shell. It had been this huge, beautiful stone church in Berlin. It was bombed to pieces, but that was only after Canterbury Cathedral in England had been bombed to pieces. And it was so moving being there because there was a shrine inside the Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche attributing and pledging not to let this happen again by both Canterbury and the congregation of the Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche. They pledged to help each other. It's very, very moving. You see these bombed out shells of a church. It was part of the bombing campaign. Now the Allies too. We think also much of the horrible Germans as the affecting and bringing on themselves all the destruction, especially with Dresden towards the end of the war. There, February 13th to 15th, 1945, a massive bombing of Dresden, which just basically leveled the city. This was called the Firestorm, the bombing of Dresden and Berlin. Kind of this, and the question becomes: to what extent was this, especially with Dresden, at the end of the war, simply retaliation? Was it simply retaliation, and then to what purpose? That's a question the Allies have to ask themselves. War is hell. That was not my phrase. Forget who famously said that, but war is hell. And it was. And this idea of we have to really destroy our enemy, not just defeat them, destroy them, was a natural and say understandable reaction. But then in hindsight, in retroactively going back and looking, which is always 2020, as the saying goes, to what purpose again? To what purpose? It's different looking back than it was looking at the time. That perspective in mind all the way through. So that was what was going on there. And it was not just in Europe that the war was being fought. It was being fought in North Africa and in Asia. And this is where I have the world context. We talked about world wars. That really was the world at war once again in that world context. Now, I have up here too the fighting in theaters of North Africa. A map, if you look at that there, you see where the Germans are coming in and the fights in the Battle of the Bulges in North Africa. You think, well, why North Africa? What was there? Well, we have still remember the remnants of colonialism because the European powers had colonies throughout Africa and Asia. So those overseas colonies are being threatened by the German advances. And the Germans are like, well, if we can go in and take over some of the areas that British and French colonies, that will help us and hurt them. The same in Asia. So this kind of attempt to fight on all fronts, which led to resistance on all fronts. Number one. Number two, in terms of not only colonialism, I thought they're the ideal of empire. If you look at that map, I talked about already the Third Reich and the Second Reich, the First Reich. The First Reich was the Reich of Frederick Barbarossa and the Holy Roman Empire, which was seen as a continuation of the Roman Empire. This ideal of empire, of world empire, goes back to Rome, ancient Rome, the Roman Empire. One of the early wars, the Punic Wars, was to conquer Carthage and take over a lot of North Africa. And so when Hitler was talking about the Third Reich, he's really talking about the Third Empire, which was the idea that the Germans were the inheritors of Rome. So he's trying to reestablish the Roman Empire in his own mind as the German Empire of Frederick Barbarossa. And that imperial issue is a major one. Now, I'm not going to make too many analogies to contemporary times. That's why with Putin, I may have already said this, but Putin's ideal, as he explicitly stated in his speech shortly after he invaded Ukraine, was to reestablish the Russian Empire of Frederick the Great. No, Peter the Great, sorry, not Frederick the Great. Excuse that, scratch that. Peter the Great of Russia, which was seen as the continuation of the Roman Empire. Supposedly Rome, quote unquote, fell. That is a myth, historiographical construct. I think I've already covered that. But if not, I should have. But it's Edward Gibbon coined the phrase, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Far more complex when we actually look at the sources of what was going on. But that ideal, dream of the Roman Empire remained all the way through the 20th century, perhaps even beyond into the 21st century. But Hitler, certainly, that was within his imagination. And therefore, too, North Africa was important. But it was also in Asia. You say, well, Asia wasn't part of the Roman Empire. No, that's still the colonial aspect of it. And the issue of Russia and France, the issue of the colonies and the Spice Islands have been going on since the 16th century. And the emerging Japanese empire after the Franco-Japanese War to reestablish or the Russo-Japanese War, which then, with France, helped Japan defeat Russia. We have then this emerging Japanese empire in the region. And that was then seen as important too for the Allies, France, Germany, and then the United States, which I'll be getting to in a moment, because of those colonies. Because of them too, we have the Soviet Union right there. So how do we deal with the Soviet Union, with the emerging Japanese empire, all threatening what had been British, French, and American colonies? How do we deal with all of that? So there's began to be a sense of we have to fight against this expanding Japanese empire, which was kind of allying with the Germans by and large. And so we're talking about here the Pacific theater, we have the African theater, and we have the European theater. So it's really this three geographical territories that all ended up being at war all at once. And it was difficult. Originally, as I said, Germany had great success. Originally, Japanese empire was expanding and growing, taking over Korea. Oh, yeah. I mean, I can tell stories about that. The Koreans and the Japanese hate each other, basically, just like the Dutch hate the Germans, and still because of occupation. And there's tension still in Europe today because of World War II and the German aggression. It gets very messed up. Anyway, but that's kind of, we'll deal with some of that later, of course. The U.S., meanwhile, was reluctant to get involved. Now, some of the things in terms of Japanese and Allied response was already after the U.S. gets involved, but it was late getting involved because the U.S. didn't want to get involved. They knew what had happened in World War I and the shock and horror that was. They had no interest in getting involved in yet another world war. So they adopted a position of isolationism, almost like, no, we're going to focus on our own stuff. That's what we need to do, not worry about what's going on in Europe or in the East, Far East. Number one. Number two, basically, that we're worried about communism too, just like England at first was and France. Appeasement of Hitler. I'm not going to say there's never really been, to my knowledge, it could not been a World War II scholar, an accusation that the U.S. adopted a position of appeasement. It's more of tacit allowance and not opposition to, or of Hitler, his growth of Hitler because of their fear of communism. We sent scientists in terms of the eugenics, which I mentioned last lecture. Some of our big industrialists, Henry Ford, Walt Disney, were all supporters of Hitler early on. Okay, there's a big distinction here. That's what we see. Hindsight is one thing, but as you're looking forward, they see Hitler as a strong leader who is helping U.S. business by being the European guard against communism. And then what happened? Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. That brought U.S. into the war. Why did they do so? Well, they figured they needed to expand and control the Pacific. And what is between Japan and the west coast of the United States? Hawaii. That is where Pearl Harbor is. If we can have a preemptive strike, so to speak, we can at least help cut off that line across the Pacific of the U.S. getting involved. Pearl Harbor was a shock, a greater shock than 9/11. We had never been attacked. This was the first attack on the U.S. homeland, so to speak, since, let's say, the Revolutionary War, the French Indian War, and so the War of 1812 in any case. And that mobilized the U.S. They started taking measures. And one of the measures they took was we have to guard against any further Japanese machinations against the U.S. And so, especially on the West Coast, Japanese Americans who were U.S. citizens, Japanese American citizens, were rounded up and put in concentration camps. Now, too, is a story that's not often told. It's not one of the most outstanding episodes in U.S. history. But there was this fear of the enemy, the fear of the other, even though they are American citizens. But we had just been attacked by Japan, so we're going to put them in concentration camps. And when I talk about concentration camps, I'm not talking about the Nazi concentration camps or the work camps, or as they were called, the death camps, which I'll be talking about in a second. But they were not necessarily pleasant, and the Japanese citizens had to leave their home, and they were, guarded and recorded and watched in a particular area, a camp. It was not a positive. But then we also not only get into the war against Japan, but we decide that to do that, we also have to help out France and Britain because Hitler was winning. Britain was holding on. France had already been occupied and taken over, basically. There was the opposition, Vichy France. But it was like, what do we do? It's almost comes back to what's left is Britain, and they're alone. We have to help. And the U.S. mobilizes. It says, we are going to get involved. We're not going to let this continue. And on D-Day, June 6, 1944, American and British forces invade the continent. We'd already been in England. We invaded the continent on D-Day. And the counterattack really begins. And they liberate France to great celebration and thanks and everything else, and begin to really fight back Hitler's forces. And the tide turns. Once the U.S. enters the war in 1941, the tide begins to turn. We'll see about that in a few slides later. But it did take a while before all that to happen. And shortly after the U.S. gets involved in the war, I'm not going to say therefore because of that, Hitler and his government formulate what they called the final solution. January 1942, officially adopted. Final solution. Now, anti-Semitism, as we've seen already, as I talked about last lecture, in terms of the Dreyfus Affair in France, the anti-Semitism and the pogroms of Russia, the whole problem of what was going on, which was still going on at this time. What do we do with the Jews? 1939, the British White Paper. It was a problem. It had been a problem going all the way back. This is not, I'm not going to go through the whole history of anti-Semitism in Europe once again, but it was a real problem. And for Hitler, it's like the Jews were never part of us. They are a different linguistic group, even though they're Semitic in the broadest sense. Semitic languages are part of the original Sanskrit and all those things developed from they're out of. Anyway, they had never been incorporated within Europe. They were always seen as outsiders. Once they had been expelled from the Roman Empire after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 CE, 132 135, they're in diaspora. They have no place to be, no place to go. That's the problem, the issue. They would never assimilate. There's all kinds of other problems there, but that was the idea of, with Hitler, we need to purify our blood. If we are going to pull this off here in 1942, now the United States are involved. It's kind of a world war indeed. We've been extremely successful from Hitler's perspective, and we're going to win this thing, but we need to make sure that we are strong and don't allow any enemies from within to undermine that Aryan strength of the master race. We're going to get rid of the Jews. We're going to get rid of the Jews. once and for all. Okay? This is a program of genocide. Gens, in Latin, means a people, a tribe, a people, a group. Genocide is killing of a people. A systematic, planned extermination of a people. The word is often thrown about just based on horrors. When a lot of members of a particular group are killed, we often refer to it, oh, that's genocide, oh, that's genocide, oh, that's genocide, because it has this huge effect based on the Holocaust. The systematic, programmatic, planned extermination of a people. I have up there the Holocaust. I'll be talking about the term Holocaust toward the end of the slide, as you see there at the bottom. But it's the word that we use. And we always associate the Holocaust with the Jews, and rightly so, without question. We often forget that there were others exterminated in the Holocaust as well. We have up there the Holocaust, homosexuals, gypsies, the mentally and physically handicapped, and the Jews. Now, that's playing a little bit with language because the Jews were the focus. The Jews were the focus. Also, in terms of the plans, the final solution, it's like if we can rid our society of the weak links, not just the Jews, but any weak link, to help purify the blood in the sense of a scientific eugenic understanding based on the master race of the Aryans, based on linguistic, cultural identity, ethnic identity, that will be a positive for us. Who is a problem? Homosexuals are a problem. Gypsies are a problem. They're not even really Aryan. They're not Indo-European. They're Hungarian. Hungarian is not an Indo-European language. Also called the Romi or Romani because they were roaming around. We refer to them commonly, colloquially as the Gypsies, who didn't really have a place. We'll get rid of them. And of course, any individual, even German individuals who are mentally or physically defective from the perspective of the master race, we need to get rid of those too. That is overall, the Holocaust was not just the Jews, even if the Jews bore the overwhelming brunt of it all and were the focus of the final solution. Now here we get to the labor camps and the concentration camps, where these peoples, Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, mentally and physically handicapped, all brought together in a place. And then what do we do with them? How do we bring about a mass extermination? And the gas chambers was, let's say, the technological solution. Now here we have genocide again. 90% of Polish Jews and 67% of European Jews were exterminated based on a strategic and systematic policy. Just think about that for a minute. Hitler's final solution didn't succeed in exterminating all of the Jews, but got rid of 2/3 of the Jews in Europe, 90% of the Jews in Poland. I have up here the victims of the Holocaust in numbers. When we deal with numbers, with something at this massive a scale, it's difficult. We can't get a precise count. That's almost impossible. So all of these numbers are estimations. But they get at the actuality of the proportion. So whether there were, actually 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust, or 5,900,000, or 6,300,000, is, I'm not going to say irrelevant, but we can't have a precise recognition and definition based on numbers. So keep that in mind. Now, I have it here, I still here with the gas chambers, because we think of, the kind of the common perception, I think, I could be wrong, but I think of, Holocaust, killing of the Jews, gas chambers. That's very valid. Gas chamber was just one technique of mass extermination. So when we go up there, here we have the gas chambers, also these estimated numbers. Estimated approximately around 960,000 Jews were exterminated in the gas chambers. 74,000 non-Jewish Poles were exterminated in gas chambers. 21,000 Romani, or Gypsies, were exterminated in the gas chambers. 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war were exterminated in the gas chambers, and approximately 15,000 others were exterminated in the gas chambers. The gas chamber was a very effective instrument of the final solution and for the extermination of the Jews. It wasn't the only one. Here's where we get to the other means of extermination. One was just mass graves, digging a big hole, shooting, and then pushing people into it and shooting them all. There's all kinds of evidence for that. And actually here, my father, I think I mentioned last lecture, was in World War II. He was in Europe. He was in Germany after the victory in Europe Day, which I'll talk about shortly. Kind of cleaning up, guarding German prisoners. And one of the places he was in the little town he referred to as Dingelfing. I never looked up Dingelfing on the map. It's probably in Bavaria or Swabia, where the ing is very common. It makes perfect sense that there is a town called Dingelfing. I'm not saying that there isn't. But it was a relatively small town. And he said outside the town was a mass grave with over 800 bodies. He said the thing is, the people of the town claimed they knew nothing about it. They said, no, we didn't know that. So my dad said that he and his fellow American GIs who were there basically rounded up the entire town and marched them out to the grave, to the mass grave, to show them, say, look, this is what you Germans did, and how could you say you didn't even know about it? It's quite something. Such mass graves were common. So when we talk about the Holocaust, it's not just the gas chambers. When we look at the Jews, there's approximately 1 million Jews were exterminated in the gas chambers. Overall, over approximately 6 million Jews were exterminated overall. So the gas chamber was not even the most deadly mechanism used for the extermination of the Jews. Because we have about, in terms of the Holocaust as such, with the Jews, we have about 6 million Jews were exterminated. We have about 270,000 disabled people, between 250,000 and 500,000 Gypsies in the Romani, and between 5,000 and 15,000 homosexuals and others. So this term Holocaust, it's so overarching and horrific and horrendous, it doesn't really capture what was going on. And that's why Hebrew does not use the term Holocaust for what was going on. In Hebrew, the term is Shoah. The Shoah. The Shoah is catastrophe, calamity, horror. Holocaust is a Hebrew term, Greek term, Hebrew term translated into Greek, translated into English, which meant burnt offering. A burnt offering that was totally burnt up was called a Holocaust. And in the Jewish tradition, it was based on the burnt offerings offered to God as a sacrifice. As a sacrifice. As an apology for their sin, to appease God. It was a religious concept. That's why the Jews in Hebrew don't refer to the Holocaust as, don't refer to what happened in World War II as the Holocaust. They refer to it as the Shoah. But everywhere else, too, and the Jews don't dismiss or argue against the term Holocaust. But we have to think of, to what extent was this a sacrifice of the Jews? That's almost a perverse understanding of it. They weren't sacrificing to God. They were being sacrificed, but the Nazis certainly weren't sacrificing the Jews to they were sacrificing the Jews to their ideal of the purity of the Aryan race. In that sense, okay, maybe. But because of all this, we focus so much on the Jews, as we should. But it was broader than that. That's what just the point I want to make. I'm not trying to lessen the horror and the Jewish horror of the Shoah that happened to them and others. That's my point. That's my point in terms of dealing with the unmanageable, unfathomable events of the Shoah throughout Europe and what that meant. Now, the final solution, formulated in 1942, once the Americans get involved after D-Day, pretty soon it becomes clear that the British and the Americans, with the liberated France, was going to be successful in defeating Hitler and the aggression of the Nazis. Hitler and Italy as allies. And Hitler commits suicide on April 30th, 1945. On May 8th, 1945, victory in Europe is declared. That's pretty impressive. Very impressive indeed. Could that have happened without the U.S. intervention? I don't think so. Well, we don't know. We can't go back and rerun it, but Hitler had been doing extremely well. It was the salvation of Europe, especially France and England, from German aggression and German pretense of empire. And yet, once that was proclaimed and achieved, victory in Europe, we still had, and that also included North Africa, victory in Europe, North Africa, I should have said actually, we still had the problem of the Pacific. It took a little while longer. Not a whole lot, but a little bit. But things really had developed. I mentioned my dad being in Germany, prisoner of war and things, and other stories I could tell about it, but he already had his orders for the invasion of Japan. He was a private first class, but still private. He had served as a secretary in England to generals, sergeants, and generals. So he was a clerical staff. He hadn't really been trained in infantry. He had no infantry experience. And then he was, prison guard and mopping up in Germany after victory in Europe Day. And he had his orders for the invasion of Japan. He was a private, designated as infantry. He would be on the very front lines going in. And everyone knew that the fighting in the East was brutal. You probably have seen the famous statue of Iwo Jima. It's part of that Eastern Asian theater of the war, Pacific War. Islands to islands, basically jungle warfare, a real mess. So what was the U.S. to do? This goes back to why I brought up and discussed last lecture the new physics. Because there was a new weapon that was being planned. I think I mentioned that the Manhattan Project started in 1942 to weaponize the new physics. And it had become successful in developing just that. President Roosevelt died in April of 1945, and Harry Truman becomes president on April 12th, 1945. And he has to make, from the very get-go of his presidency, an absolutely horrific decision. We have this new weapon. Do we use it or not? Do we use it or not? If any of you have seen the movie Oppenheimer, you know some of the issues involved here. The atom bomb was tested in the desert. Extremely impressive. They knew it could do massive amounts of damage and also civilian damage. So the question was, do we use this new weapon, this weapon of horror and destruction, the atomic bomb? Or do we stick to conventional means of warfare, quote unquote conventional means of warfare, and invade? What was at stake? Millions of American lives, it was estimated. My dad certainly felt that he was going to his death, having given orders for his death. And Truman had to make that calculation. What do we do? Well, number one, we'll try to tell them we're coming, that we have this, and to get out. They chose two sites, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They didn't choose Tokyo. They just wanted to say, look, stop. They dropped leaflets to say, get out. We're coming. We have this new weapon. It will do massive destruction. Get out now. They still didn't know about nuclear fallout and the deaths that occur because of a nuclear explosion long after the nuclear explosion. Truman decided to use it. And on August 6, 1945, dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima. It was a shock. The pilot of the plane who flew it had no idea what he was doing and what he was dropping when he had. It freaked him out. And then 3 days later, on August 9th, they did Nagasaki. And the Japanese were like, whoa, that was, oh my God. But that's probably the only one they have. We can just stick this out and then boom, no, we're going to do it again, Nagasaki, boom. And that led to okay, we quit. September 2nd, 1945, victory in the Pacific. And with that, World War II came to an end. Problem now was, now what do we do? The U.S. is the leader of the Western free world, Pax Americana. And now what? Well, that's one thing. A result of World War II is American power and influence had just surged. It already became huge after World War I, and then after World War II, this is something the world had never seen, really. Pax Americana goes back to that concept of Pax Romana, the Roman peace. This is the American peace whereby we can have a world order based on peace with the strength and power and influence of the U.S. being used for that within the entire world, global context, let's say. If we don't, we've seen what happens with isolationism, both in World War I and in World War II. But to get there, it took a little bit. It took a little while. And we have the beginnings of the refashioning of Europe with the big three, as they were called. Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the creator of the New Deal, which we talked about last week, was also the wartime leader of the U.S. as president. Churchill, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England, and then Joseph Stalin, the leader of Russia, the Soviet Union. Those big three leaders met in Tehran in 1943. So even before victory in Europe Day, but they begin to see Americans are already into the war, of course. Say, how are we going to do this? We have to start talking about, in phrasing today, how are we going to win the peace? How is this going to come about? How can we coordinate? How can we bring this war to an end in Tehran? How can we figure this out? The atomic bomb was not mentioned. It was known that Germany was trying to develop something like that. I don't know if the atomic bomb was mentioned or not, but it's not in the official records. But it's like, okay, how do we strategize working together to coordinate the ending of this war that we can see as a possibility now? Then, towards the end of the war, they meet in Yalta again in February of 1945, shortly before the Victory in Europe Day of May. And then in July, the Big Three meet in Potsdam in July of 1945. So before or after the Victory of Europe Day, but before the victory in the Pacific in September, in October. And also, it was a different Big Three. By this time, Truman was president of the U.S. Churchill had died, and Attlee, or not, I don't know if he died, but he stepped down. Attlee was prime minister of Britain, but Stalin was still there. So it's Truman, Attlee, and Stalin met at Potsdam to say, okay, how are we going to divide up the world now? It was while they were still having their discussions at Potsdam that Truman received word of the atomic bombs. I mean, he had already made the decision, but it's pretty impressive in the ending of the war. What they came up with was essentially, this is again, U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? That was the issue with Stalin and the USSR. For Britain, the U.S., and France, we were wary of the USSR. But they fought Germany too, and they suffered tremendously. That's one thing about the Russians. They have an amazing capacity to suffer. And that goes back to the 19th century, all along Dostoevsky and the whole bit. So these are very much tensions between the Big Three. France is not really involved because France, as I said, had been occupied since 1940. They've been freed, but then there's still this tensions. But France is kind of there in the background. But it's England, U.S., and the USSR dividing up the world. And kind of the concept they come up with is the spheres of influence. Who's going to be responsible for what? And we'll be talking more about this in the next lecture. But they end up partitioning Germany between the Soviet sphere of influence and the American British sphere of influence. And they even did that with Berlin, which was technically in what became known as East Germany under Soviet influence. But Berlin would be divided itself into East and West Berlin. So West Berlin was this little island that was associated with the West, i.e., France, Britain, and the U.S., within and right next to Eastern Berlin or East Berlin, which is part of the Soviet Union influence, as well as East Germany. In East Germany, the dividing line was Berlin was within East Germany. We'll be again talking more about this next lecture or so with the Cold War. But it became to be this really bizarre issue and caused problems. We'll talk about the Berlin airlift and everything else and the problems that was emerging, because what was emerging, even with the settlement of World War II, that everybody was so excited that it was over and so relieved that it was over and that it could have turned out differently. The horrors were beginning to flood in, just like with World War I, after World War I. And the horrors of what had happened, including in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the horrors of the atomic bomb, unthinkable, unimaginable horrors, were beginning to sink in. It's like we have to prevent this from ever happening again. And what emerged from World War II was a world order of two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. France, I already said, had already been taken over. They were freed, but they were taken over. Britain had been bombed to hell. Europe had been bombed to hell. So many people died. Britain had to rebuild. They had no much strength left. We'll talk more about this again too next lecture. Had to kind of divest themselves of what had been the British Empire. This is really the end of colonialization. And we have the USSR and the US. And really, from the very end of World War II, we have the onset of what became known as the Cold War and the new order within a global context of the two superpowers. with the U.S. as the leader of the Western quote-unquote free world, the Pax Americana, and with the Soviet Union as the leaders of the communist, quote-unquote communist. I hope you know what I mean by that now. The communist Eastern world. And these two ideologies, these two worldviews could not coincide. It's about the Cold War, this ideological struggle that had led the U.S. and Britain, anyway, to almost support Hitler as he's trying to stand up against communism. This fascism based on populist nationalism, as I argued, was very much opposed to the fascism, let's say, the dictatorial fascism of communism. How do we reconcile these two sides? It wasn't clear. And it was tense. And we came to the brink of all-out nuclear war. But we'll talk about that next time. That's what I wanted to say about World War II. Read the textbook and the details in there. We can't understand our world today without understanding World War II. We can't understand World War II without understanding World War I. We can't understand World War I without understanding the 19th century developments, and we can't understand the 19th century developments unless we go back and understand the 16th century developments that brought us from medieval Christendom into early modern and then modern Europe, and as we'll see for the rest of this course, into into postmodern context. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.